Hello and welcome to this module on networking in Azure. We're going to start by talking about networking in the cloud. What does it look like to create networks in the cloud versus in a data center where you've got physical hardware and Ethernet cables that you manage? We'll talk about virtual networks that are a critical part of any networking that you set up in Azure. Talk about VPN connections and different ways that you can connect your Azure resources back to your data center and vice versa. And we'll talk about a number of different networking services that are provided in Azure that you can take advantage of as you build your solutions. Now, you may remember me saying something along these lines that you don't have to worry about infrastructure when you're out in Azure and building your solutions. And now I'm telling you, you got to set up networks and manage these things. Virtual networks are something you can opt into if it makes sense for your solution. There are many different ways that you can build a solution and not have to get down to the nitty-gritty. If you build a web application and scale it out to multiple instances, you don't have to manage virtual networks and firewalls and load balancers and all that stuff if you don't want to. But we're going to look at the options you have when you do choose to take advantage of the networking capabilities. As I said, virtual networks are one of the key components of networking in Azure, and they allow you to define a network. They're not all that different from what you would expect in that you're setting up subnets and other information inside of your network. The difference is that they're all virtual and they're all just defined inside the Azure data centers. What that means is that you have a lot of related things that you can set up. For example, you can request and set up a public IP address. So if you have a machine or some instance that needs to be addressable publicly via an IP address, you can set that up. Now, of course, being security conscious, you may want to set up network security groups. Think from my network, what traffic is allowed out, on what port, to what destination, what are the protocols that are supported. And we also have application security groups, so you don't have to define this for every single virtual machine or service that's running. You can pull things together into a group and provide rules around ingress and egress of network traffic. And we also have service endpoint policies. Think about services like the data stores that we talked about previously, maybe blob storage or a SQL database. You may want to access that from your Azure web application, for example, but maybe you don't want the data that's in the blob storage to be exposed publicly. So you can set up a service endpoint policy that says this particular set of data in my Azure blob storage is only accessible from this virtual network, giving you more security and more control over what can access that data. Aside from the core networking pieces, there's a number of services that are extremely useful. One of the common things people need to do is connect their Azure resources to their on-premise resources, and you can use ExpressRoute, which is a VPN solution for connecting those two environments. And you can also use an on-premise data gateway when there's maybe a particular service or server in your data center that needs to be reachable from Azure resources, for example. You don't need to have an entire network. You just need to have a gateway that allows you to talk to those finite set of services. Above and beyond those networks, we've got a number of great network services that you can take advantage of. A CDN, or content delivery network, that allows you to have data cached out at the edge near your customers. We have Traffic Manager that allows you to write rules and manage the traffic for your customers. Again, maybe to get them to an instance of your web application that's nearest them, or to do load balancing across regions, for example. There are load balancers that you can set up and configure. There is some default load balancing that happens, but you have the ability to go in and create and manage a load balancer if you need to. And then we have DNS, the DNS zones that you can set up inside your Azure environment. So if you need to have name resolution, you don't want to deal in IP addresses, you can set up DNS for your networks and manage that. When you think about building a solution in the cloud and having it publicly available, of course, you're going to think about security and the impact of having that resource available on the internet. So there's a variety of services such as denial of service protection, an application gateway that allows you to set up a front end to do things like SSL offloading and managing traffic across regions. And there's a front door service. It's all about creating entry points into a microservices architecture that again helps you manage security, load, and traffic. We take a look at some examples of how you can leverage these networking services. One might be building out a hybrid network. Maybe you've got a web application that you're building for the cloud, and you're going to set that up in a virtual network to take advantage of all that that provides. And you want to be able to talk to some service back in your data center. You can use ExpressRoute to set up a VPN connection between your web application, your virtual network out in Azure, and your data center, allowing those two to connect and communicate with each other so that from the web application's perspective, that service is just accessible over the network. In another example, you may be doing a full cloud solution. So you're building a cloud-based web application in Azure. Maybe you've got it set up in a couple different regions, and you want to put Traffic Manager in front of it to help manage the network traffic, make sure you route customers to the node or instance that's closest to them, or just do round robin or disaster recovery across regions. And you may take advantage of blob storage for storing images and large files that are part of that web application. And then you can use the content delivery network to take advantage of caching of all of that data. And again, cache it near the customer so they get the best performance and experience. And finally, remember that you can set up that virtual network for your web application. Chances are pretty good you're going to be accessing some data, but maybe you want to make sure by using a service endpoint policy that only your virtual network can connect to that data source. So you can use that to help secure your environment and manage the network connections that can happen between your different resources. So when we look at networking in the cloud, think about networking connecting your resources together and giving you the power to control how data flows through the Azure networks or between the Azure networks in your network. There's a number of very robust networking options around caching, around security, and routing of data across those networks. And you can use those different options for managing connections between resources, things like those service endpoint policies and the virtual networks, as well as between Azure and external resources. That might be through the public IP addresses and the network and application security groups, or using ExpressRoute or those gateways to connect your Azure resources to resources in a data center outside of Azure. So again, we see that with Microsoft Azure, you have a number of different options here that you can use to fit the different requirements or different solution designs that you come up with, where you'll use maybe one of these options or many of these options together to get the end result that you need.